thank you so much for coming this evening to this extracurricular introduction to rural touring. We're joined this evening by Stephie, Natasha and Sophia, and I'll do you some brief introductions to them and just let you know how the session is going to run. So rural touring is an important part of the touring ecology in the UK and a fantastic way to reach audiences. In this session, we will cover how rural touring schemes work and programme, the logistics of what it means to make work rural touring ready, and why creating work for rural community and library spaces can be so rewarding. Stephie Jessop from the National Rural Touring Forum will give an insight into how the national network of rural touring schemes work, advice on how to ensure your work is rural tour ready, and insights on how to approach programmers. Natasha Glew, the manager of On Tour, the rural touring scheme for North Yorkshire based out of Rural Arts, will speak about their scheme, how their scheme operates, what they look for and when they're programming, and other ways to work with artists. And last but not least, we're also joined by experienced rural touring artist Sophia Hatfield, who will share her knowledge on what it takes to rural tour and why she does it. So each of those speakers is going to speak for about 20 minutes at the most. We're going to take a 5-minute break at about 6:50, and then we'll end with a 15-minute Q&A. And like I say, feel free to use the chat function if you want to be able to see those questions as you go. Is that all right with everybody? Shall we kick off? We'd like to welcome, first up, we'd like to welcome Stephie.
Hi everyone, I'm Stephie, so I am the Communications Manager for the NRTF, which is the National Rural Touring Forum. Up until yesterday, I was testing positive for COVID, so my voice is a little croakier than usual, and it might just mean that I have to stop throughout my presentation, take a drink, go on mute and cough a little bit, but bear with me, I'm sure we can power through. So just before I get into sort of the nuts and bolts of how generally rural touring works, just to give you a little overview of who the NRTF are. So we are essentially the sector support organisation for everyone involved in rural touring. So that is the artists, volunteer promoters, venues, arts organisations and rural touring schemes. We work with everyone and for everyone. We have a website, which is ruraltouring.org, which you can become a member of. I have left free artist membership up until tomorrow, which we have left for over the COVID period, but now we're in a new financial year, we are putting back in. You do not have to be a member of the NRTF in order to rural tour, but if you do, you get access to our weekly rural touring roundup, which has all the latest rural touring opportunities in it. You get a member profile and access to all of our resources on the website. We do things like intervention projects that support everyone in the sector. We have a national yearly conference. We do regular calls where we have all of the artists involved in rural touring come together on a Zoom call for us to hear about the things that are affecting artists at that point or how we might advocate better for them. And we do a lot of work around advocacy, so with DEFRA and the Arts Council and that kind of thing. That's who we are. I'm now going to get into the nuts and bolts of how rural touring works, because I know when it comes to artists, that's their number one question. So I'm going to share my screen. And we have just a short video with Ian McMillan, who, if you thought I had a northern accent, wait until you hear his in this video, and it'll just give you a very quick introduction to rural touring and the ecology of the sector.
Imagine a map of the country. Imagine the A roads that become B roads that lead to a village on a crossroads, and there, at the apex of the crossroads, at the heart of the village, is the village hall. Just look at these posters. Rural touring is a series of schemes supported by the National Rural Touring Forum that takes high quality art and performance to places that are often seen as being far from the centre of things. Although, as we know, these villages are the centre of so many things. Rural touring opens its doors to all kinds of performance for all ages. In these small venues, each one unique, each one kept in tip-top condition by committees and volunteers, you'll see theatre, music, comedy, dance, and the kind of shows you'd have to travel miles to see. Unless you're here, of course, like rural touring is. There are rural touring schemes from horizon to horizon across the land. Think of them as a festival that never ends. An off West End extravaganza. A reminder that the local experience is simply a different way in to the universal experience. There are thousands of village halls, and I'd like them all to be part of the scheme. And there are hundreds of performing groups, and I'd like them all to be part of the scheme. If you want to join this unique circuit, contact the National Rural Touring Forum. It can be a marriage made in a series of magical spaces, each one unique, each one unforgettable.
These events are unmissable, and they're good value for money.
Here you've got community really gathered together in their village hall.
The atmosphere is always great and people are always really up for it.
For us, it keeps the work alive. Like, so every space we go to, we're working with new people.
I don't know if you can see, but it's beautiful here.
Are you coming tonight?
National Rural Touring Forum. www.ruraltouring.org. Welcome to Rural Touring.
Okay, so hopefully that's inspired you slightly. You've seen a whole variety of the types of spaces that we work in. My presentation now is going to kind of break down some of that language, some of those names, some of the phrases and words you will hear thrown around rural touring, and just exactly what that means, especially for you as an artist. So a rural touring scheme is a bit like your traditional arts venue, except instead of programming across several theatres or studio spaces in one building, they work with a series of community-driven venues across a geographical location. Usually they will cover a county or two, and the venues that they work with, while that video talks a lot about village halls, they really vary in shape, size, what their normal function is. So we work with libraries, pubs, schools, community centres, traditional village halls. We've even hosted work inside people's houses before. So when you think of rural touring, it's not always just a village hall. It's often so much more than that. So the majority of schemes are either a national portfolio organisation or the Scottish equivalent, or Night Out Wales, which is run as part of the Welsh Arts Council. And there are around 30 schemes covering the majority of the rural areas in the UK. Like building-based arts venues, schemes have certain programming parameters. They tend to run their programme in seasons, mainly spring and autumn winter, for indoor work, and some schemes also take on a summer season, programming outdoor work. And since COVID, we have seen a lot more schemes start to host regular outdoor work as part of these seasons and begin to experiment with how they can add that into their regular programming. They can only program a certain amount of shows and artists every season, and this will depend on the size of the scheme, the venues they work with, and of course their budgets. Each scheme works really hard to ensure that their venues and communities have access to a really varied range of high quality art. This means that within their season, they will be programming theatre, music, dance, family and children work, spoken word, puppetry, circus, outdoor work. You get the idea. We try to cover as much as we can within our budgets and parameters as possible, because our rural communities are full of people with tastes and interests just as varied as their urban neighbours. So we put together a menu of work for our rural venues and promoters to choose from that reflects that. And so this will come to one of the first words that we throw around so much in rural touring, and that is the menu. So the menu is a crucial part of rural touring, and it is where we begin to differ from our building-based counterparts. When programming, a scheme will put together a menu of artists for their rural venues and promoters to choose from. If you're selected for the menu, this usually means that a scheme programmer has spoken to you about your work and has agreed some penciled in dates with you. usually 2 or 3 dates, a Thursday, Friday, Saturday, in which they'll say, we want you to come to Lancashire on those dates. Once a scheme has penciled in dates with you, they will work tirelessly to confirm these dates. So it's important not to double book them. Or if you are offering the same dates to several venues or schemes, being really transparent about that from the beginning and keeping everyone in the loop. Within this conversation, they'll have also checked all the other vital details they need from you, such as what the show cost is, what tech is involved, is there wraparound activity, how long is the get-in, is this the final copy for your show, do you have a trailer, which image is best to use to sell your show. Then they put together all this information together into the menu, which contains all the information any prospective venue that they work with might need in order to book your show. This menu is then sent out to all the venues and promoters that the scheme works with, and the promoters and the venues choose which show best fits for them. I am just going to take a quick pause to have a drink of water.
No problem at all, Stephie, don't worry.
I have that thing where if I start thinking, don't cough, that's when I'll start to cough. So, okay, so what or who is a promoter? So these are the people that are receiving this menu, and it's the promoter is the word that we throw around a lot in rural touring, and it might have a slightly different meaning to the one you're used to. So a promoter is a person or a group of people based in a rural area that take responsibility for choosing and then organising, promoting and hosting which professional performance is coming to their venue. They might be the village hall committee as a whole, they might be a librarian, they might be the pub landlord, they might just be one particularly passionate volunteer in a village that works with a range of different spaces in that village. Ultimately, they are the person that picks the show off the menu that best fits their venue and their audience. When doing this, they will take into account all sorts of things. Technically, is the venue big enough to host the show? Is the venue free on the date that the artists are available? So our venues are very highly in demand. So this is a really important part of the jigsaw. What did they program last season? Some promoters like to constantly switch it up. Other promoters have the one art form that they're really passionate about and they stick to that. And ultimately, do they feel confident in selling that show to their audience, who is normally their neighbours? The promoter not only chooses the show, but then sells the tickets, puts up the posters, and liaises with the artist to organise the get-in. They are also often the person running the bar on the night and the one that calls the raffle. They are the programmer, the audience development officer, the box office and front of house staff. Oh, I've lost where I meant. They basically, everyone you would find in an arts venue, wrapped up into one person. They know the majority of their audience by name. Once they've received the menu and decided which show is the best fit for them, they send that back to the scheme. They'll usually submit 2 or 3 options. The scheme will then look at everyone's submissions and put together the jigsaw that is their programme. They'll double check that shows and venues fit together, and they'll make sure that all those penciled in dates are filled, and they'll make sure things like, if you're going to one village on the Friday, you're not going to the neighbours on the Saturday because you might be splitting audiences. And that's when they will then come back to you to confirm those dates with you, contract you, and put you in touch with the venues that you're touring to. From there, you'll work with the venue and promoter to organise your show, but also with the scheme, and everyone works together to promote and market. So promoters will order leaflets and posters from you and they'll sell the tickets. The schemes will put together a season brochure and website listings. So that is kind of the ins and outs of, generally speaking, how each scheme works. Obviously, as I've said up top, every scheme is different, so they all have their own ways of how they do that. What you're probably wondering is, that's all great, but what do they programme? What do I need to do? So as I said before, a rural touring scheme programme will be as varied as an arts venue. It's not just about rural issues for rural communities.
Thank you so much. Okay, Natasha, are you okay to pick up from there for us?
I am, yes. Fabulous. I am going to load up my screen share, which is now going to confuse everyone. So I work over at Rural Arts, which is in Thirsk, North Yorkshire, although I actually live in Pudsey, West Yorkshire. So I have a bit of a commute. I also have been in the role for about 6 months as programmer, so not a huge amount of time. And I also double up and have an artist's hat as well. So sometimes that can be really useful because it means I can talk to artists a bit more from their perspective and be like, this is the stuff you need to know, this is how it works. And also that can inform how I want to program a little bit as well. So this is taken from another overview we've done before. I won't go too much into the Northern Touring, the National Rural Touring Forum schemes, because I feel like that is something Stephie's probably going to cover. So I'll just focus on who we are. So we're up in Thirsk, and Rural Arts is a charity. And first and foremost, we're actually a big arts centre. And we have lots of art studios, and we have Kiln, and we're absolutely full of community groups that are always in there doing visual arts things. We also have the courthouse, which is what it says it is on the tin. It's an old courthouse room. It holds about 45 to 60 people. It's a lovely, beautiful space, lovely tall ceilings, and we're very lucky to have a lighting rig, even though it's incredibly basic, a lighting rig and a projector. And we do host events there as well. So Thirsk is obviously a rural town. Doesn't have a huge amount of people, so we don't host loads and loads of events. And I think our town is also recovering a little bit from pandemic, as many venues are. So we're only hosting events probably once a month at the moment, until everybody feels a bit more confident with that. So as Stephie was saying, there are 30 different schemes nationwide, at least. And our scheme is called On Tour. So ours is very different to all the rest of them, as Stephie was saying. So everything I say is very much from our perspective. Stephie's already talked about what a promoter is. I think the easiest way to think about it is that they're a volunteer who runs their venue. That's probably the easiest digestible chunk. And she's also talked about what is the menu. And we've obviously talked a lot about that, so I won't go into that again. But we're just about to get on to what sort of work do we programme. So on Tour, which is obviously our programme up in North Yorkshire, we like to programme all sorts of genres, but the popular ones are music, which can be folk music, acoustic music, swing. It says on here, however, we are interested in most forms of music that have low technical requirements. So that's because our village halls, so we have about 100 promoters or venues or volunteers who are on our scheme, and they look through our menu to select our work. And I would say probably 70% of those venues don't have a rig, don't have a PA, or a projector. And they vary in size from sort of 40 seats, 40 people to sit down, to Skipton Town Hall, which is huge, like 250, 300. But the majority of them, I would say, are on the smaller side. So yes, music is something we programme. It's also very, very popular. And I think the bookers as well like it because it's sometimes it's an easier sell for them. And all of this odd language. Do ask questions if I say anything that sounds a bit jargony. So the other thing they love to book is a panto. Now, not every scheme books a panto, but we do. And we've used a couple of different companies. But the very traditional panto is what they love. So we've had Tailgate Theatre before, and before that it was Pocket Panto. So they love a panto. We also programme a lot of dance. So there are a couple of reasons we program a lot of contemporary dance, partly because, as it says on the slide, we've been working with the Rural Touring Dance Initiative. I hope I got those letters right, which was a national initiative to be able to make sure that contemporary dance could reach rural touring areas and remote villages and take work from London out to the country. And that was a wonderful scheme because it meant that dance is one of the most expensive art forms to create and produce and tour. And obviously our village hall with a budget of £300 was never going to afford it. So it meant that it really was much more accessible, much more affordable, and really was getting dance to the places that may never have had it. The other thing we like to program is comedy. Again, a nice accessible art form. We're obviously it can cross genres. And it's a wonderful way of bringing in lots of different cultures as well. And it's very popular. And obviously they like contemporary theatre as well. I think there's been much more of a push for that in more recent years, probably sort of new people like me coming in, programmers who are seeing more contemporary theatre and thinking this is got the same exciting quality and accessibility that our promoters are going to like. And you can see one of Bradford Producing Hub's ones there, which I went and saw and managed to get a few dates for on our scheme last season. Classic theatre, what we call, so this includes like Shakespeare, classic plays, these are really, really popular. And these are really popular for adult audiences, I would say, as well. So to be honest, I'd never seen quite so much traditional classic theatre until I'd started working at Rural Touring. So if that's what you make, it's a big plus. And slowly we're starting to programme more interactive and multimedia performances, again, that you could say they're more contemporary. So for example, we recently had the Dark Room up at Thirsk, which is based on sort of a projector, and he's wearing like a games console and it's all connected through. We've also had a show about fax machines, which sounds low tech, but it was actually incredibly complicated. But I think it depends on the venue. Like, so Thirsk, as I said, we do have a basic rig and a basic projector. So we were in a position to be able to host interactive multimedia shows. I'm not sure the rest of our venues would be up for that at the moment, but it's something I think a lot of programmers are keen to try and get more experimental work out there and push those boundaries as well. So the other thing, of course, is children's and family theatre, another really popular area. And it's probably also worth mentioning that every time we do a menu, which covers a season, so I've just done a menu for autumn and spring, there's always one of every genre in there. Because we have to make sure that we are programming for all types of audiences. So there will always be a children's, a dance, a music, classic theatre, contemporary theatre, and sometimes we double up. One of the key things for, because rural arts and on tour is funded by Arts Council, as most are, is that Arts Council like us to put the choice of what is programmed to the promoters. Sorry, too many P words. To the promoters. So we like to put in quite a few options. So I've put in 2 or 3 contemporary theatre choices into the menu because I've sort of either gone to see them or recognise that they're good quality, etc., etc. But then it is down to the promoter, the volunteer in that village hall to make the final choice. And that can sometimes be quite harsh because actually you might end up going to a really good theatre company. I'm really sorry, but you weren't selected this time. And that's nothing to do with the quality of their work. It's just sometimes if we're giving those options out, it just sometimes doesn't go that way. And finally, circus. Again, not all schemes will take this work, but we've started trying to get it a bit more out there. It's a wonderfully accessible art form, I think, and can go in multiple spaces. We've actually just programmed our first ever piece of aerial. So, well, I say program, we've put it in the menu and I'm really hopeful for it. Fingers crossed. It's got a rig of multiple sizes, which I think helps because that's probably one of the limitations of circus is things like height, floor, and setup, takedown, and all of that stuff that can really impact how a promoter or a volunteer essentially goes, oh, that sounds like it could damage our floor, or it won't fit, or, you know, am I going to have to do any heavy lifting? All these things that we try as the programmers to kind of smooth that transition from the artist going into the building and coming out. Just noticed baby on camera. So I'm probably not very soothful singing voice. So our next slide is going to venue locations. So specifically in On Tour, we obviously have we go through North Yorkshire, but actually On Tour and a lot of the other schemes have very strange boundaries. So you'd think that North Yorkshire would just be anything with that postcode, but actually we go up all the way up to the Tees Valley. And we've actually even got a few venues that we cover in West Yorkshire. I went to one that was closer to Pontefract than it was to Thirsk, and this the other side of York the other week. So yeah, we have got a bit of a strange boundary system. So what I would advise to any artist who's thinking about touring is just make sure you contact as many of the different schemes as possible, because you don't know who covers what area a lot of the time. And sometimes we don't even know. So I would spread your applications wide, just so that you kind of cover the areas that you want to cover in the north. So on our slide, we have got some examples of the venues that you might go to and some of the distances. So because North Yorkshire is huge, as I'm sure you all know, but what you need to think about when it comes to touring, as Stephie was saying, if you're booked for 2 or 3 days, is actually you might be booked in North Yorkshire at one of our venues, but the next day you might be booked at somewhere, as we can see here. If you're booked in Hunmanby Village Hall to Ingleborough, you're going to be travelling 124 miles. So you might think, oh, I'm only touring in North Yorkshire, it'll be nice and easy. The reality is, yeah, it can be quite a big travelling between them. Now, when we are working out your tour, if you are very lucky to get a couple of days in a row, which is what we would hope for, we do try and make it an easy tour route. We wouldn't make you kind of zigzag across the county where possible. But yes, it is just worth keeping in mind that the venues can be quite far apart. And also we've got on here some examples of how different the venues are. So we've got the smallest venue in Welburn Village Hall, and the largest is Masham Town Hall. The largest capacity is Skipton with 250, and Oswald Kirk Village Hall's only got 40. And then obviously tallest ceilings, shortest ceiling, useful information for us to remember when we're putting artists in places. I think it's really important as well as an artist to know that just because our venues vary massively, that doesn't mean, and if your work wouldn't work for 1 or 2 of them, that doesn't mean we won't consider you. And it also doesn't mean that you should completely change your show to fit those venues. Because that's one thing I'm always advising artists that come to me and they're sort of saying, oh, well, we're making this show and we're thinking about, but it needs to be in somewhere tall. And I'm just like, well, then that's what you need, and it's our job as the programmers to try and make sure that that's communicated. So I would always advise keeping these things in mind is useful in the kind of making of your project. But if you've already finished your project, don't worry about spending an arm and a leg. Just be honest and say what you need with that. We've got some fun slides about other random trivia. I think my colleague who helped me make this was a big fan of random trivia. So we have 2 venues in 2 of the national parks. There are 3 Daltons in North Yorkshire and the Tees Valley. We only have venues in 1 of them. Gosh, I mean, this trivia is pretty dry. So let's move on to how do I apply for rural touring? This is obviously what you all want to know as artists. So majority of rural touring schemes will have a form on their website, or they will advertise an email address to contact the programmers directly. Ours, for example, is there, programming@ruralarts.org. The best thing to do is to send a tour pack and to make sure that all the information you have about your show is in that tour pack. You can also invite us to come see your work, but a lot of us work part-time, so please don't be offended if we are not available. And I would say, as much as you can, include video, because we will want to see the work as much as possible, and images, sort of transferring those sort of things is really useful. We do get a lot of emails, a lot of emails. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't send your work across, but I would always say as well is make sure you've really thought about that email before you send it. There's no point just sending a hello, a bit awkward, here's just the name of my show, because we're reading them quite fast and you want it to come off the page and hit us in the face with, I've thought about this email, I've thought about the content, here is my show, and here's what I'm talking about. Now, obviously, you might not be at that stage in your career yet, and that's absolutely fine too. We do have a lot of time at Rural Arts, and some of the other schemes have put things in place to support artists. So if you do want to send a more kind of, I would like some further advice, then those emails are definitely welcome, but I probably wouldn't send them to the programming email address. I would probably try and send them to a more generic email address. You're more than happy to contact me directly or just go through the Rural Arts website. It's just when we're looking through that programming email box, that's where we're looking for the tour packs. So yes, so that's how I would suggest applying. But there are 30 schemes, so I would definitely get onto the Northern Rural Touring Forum because, as Stephie said, the memberships are free until tomorrow. And also, go through all of that and make a big old spreadsheet and contact as many as you can. So how do we select work? So this is always a difficult question to answer, but we've tried our best here. So we select work primarily based on quality. That's one of the big things. We are funded by Arts Council, so Arts Council sort of dictate a lot of the kind of the boundaries of which we will select work as well, which I think is important because then that kind of keeps everybody into a sort of measurable place. We are interested in shows with small casts or small cast requirements such as one-handed plays. So this comes down to costs. For us on tour, our specific scheme, I wouldn't say we have huge budgets. So any show with a smaller cast between 1 and 3 people generally doesn't cost as much to tour as a very large panto or a 10-piece ballet or a brass band. Sort of number of people generally means that the costs are less. So that is always helpful for us. But we don't just program 1 or 3 person shows. Due to the nature of our venues, we're looking for shows which either have low tech requirements or self-contained. So as I've mentioned, 70% of our venues don't have tech. Or reliable tech or tech from this century. So, and a lot of them don't have a tech person on site either. I'd say higher than 70% don't have anybody there who will do your tech for you. So the best thing to do is to bring all of your own kit that you know how to program and work, that you can take into a venue, set up and manage. And then all you need to worry about is making sure it's pat tested and that you've got access to a 13 amp plug. That's the best way to do it. Again, you don't have to. As I've said, we have had shows that work with projectors and the projectors were in-house, but that is always helpful. So budgets, we do have a finite amount of money and we have to balance that very carefully. So that's always just worth something keeping in mind. We are only 50% of the selection panel. So this is a really important thing. So when you're contacting me or Stephie or whoever, we kind of call it like the first hurdle, I guess, is to get into the menu. As I've mentioned, you might get into the menu, but then the promoters are the ones that choose you. And if they don't think you're right for their audience or for whatever reason, they don't choose you. Sadly, that does happen sometimes. Some of our venues don't like booking work that's explicit. It sort of says what it is on the tin. Like bad language is something that comes up a lot. We have to make sure we sort of mention that in our menus when we're talking about your work. But that doesn't stop us programming work with bad language. You just have to say whether it does or not, just so that they're not shocked. We are interested in work which is suitable for a wide variety of ages and families. And we like work which our experience, that's not worded very well, but as we find these are often selected by promoters. So what we mean by that is that it's not just a show. And I think, like, if I have my artist hat on, I find this very frustrating because what we're saying on Rural Touring is you've worked really hard to make a theatre show and you've put loads of time and effort into it, but could you just do another thing as well? So it's just worth thinking about it when you're in the making process. How can I make this a little bit more of an experience? So we've had shows that come in and they will work with the local village restaurants and provide food. We've had companies that come in and help run a raffle. We've had people come in and they run a workshop. Essentially, we've had people who do like live cooking during the shows. Doesn't have to always be about food, but food is a big thing. I love food. But essentially, if you can think about your show and what the extra thing might be. So we had a dance piece and at the end they had a ceilidh. And I feel like the majority of people booked that show because there was a ceilidh at the end. But that does sound pretty exciting. So it's just worth thinking, what would be the extra offer? What is your, to be consumerist sounding, your unique selling point? And it's sort of worth thinking around your subject area and how we can, make you the most sellable, most appealing as possible. Yes, and for us at Rural Arts, inclusivity and diversity is super important, and we make sure that we've got that in our menu as much as possible. It's something that we go through, and we are very, Max, our CEO, sits us down and we look at all the percentages of who we're representing. So it's something, we're super keen to improve that even more, to be honest. So if you're making work that is diverse, please do get in touch. And that is the end of my presentation. I realised that I probably spoke quite fast. And if there was captioning on, it would have been a garbled mess.
I was keeping an eye on it. It wasn't too bad. It did occasionally, as it always does, get a bit confused. But if you wouldn't mind just stopping your screen share, please.
I can.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That has been such a useful insight. Stephie, don't worry that you didn't quite make it all the way through. Is there anything you wanted to add before we take a break?
I think I won't bring up my presentation again because it does reiterate a lot of what Tasha said, but I think there's a couple of things that I would pick up from in terms of the variety of schemes and how they program. So that tech thing, I also work for Spot on Lancashire, which is Lancashire's rural and community touring network. We say everything you need to run your show must be in the van with you. And we also emphasise the need for the van because there are points in Lancashire that if you were to go from one village to another, it would take you 2 days on public transport. So you have to be fully technically self-sufficient. And it is a numbers game with rural touring across the country. The more technically self-sufficient you are, the better your numbers are and the better we have the chance of finding a venue that can take your work. That thing about sometimes promoters being a little afraid of explicit work, that's about being as upfront as possible right from the beginning about what your show is about. So a while ago, I think rural touring had a reputation for wanting to provide good time shows and entertaining shows. And it's not that as such, but our communities like to come together for a good night out. And what I always define a good night out is that you've brought the community together for a reason. Now, that might be to have a conversation that community has never had because your piece of theatre is issue-based, or it might be that you've opened up an art form that they've never seen before, but there has to be something that we can let the promoter know exactly what it is that they're getting. And we do a lot of sort of matchmaking in rural touring in terms of kind of guessing up front which promoters are going to go for which shows and knowing whose arms we can twist as well to fill dates for you. So just been really upfront, and we have asked people to count how many swear words are in their shows. And that's because it comes back down to the fact that the promoter is the person selling the tickets. And you're also often going into a venue that's where Baby Bounce and Rhyme is, or yoga class, and it's a place where people feel very safe. And so if we shock them with explicit material that they weren't expecting, we did that in their house effectively. And they're going to complain to the promoter when they see them trying to buy milk the next day. It's not going to a complaints department in a theatre. So that is one thing that I would pick up on. And then the other thing is every scheme takes submissions for programming differently. And I know that can sound very annoying and it's very time consuming and it puts a lot of work on you, but it is just the same as how every arts venue takes programming submissions in different forms. So some schemes have very specific online forms they need you to fill out. They will not take anything by email. And that's because of the way that they then use that information to go out to all of their promoters. So for example, I know that NEAT up in Scotland, they have a very specific form that pulls together that database, and the promoters also have a very specific computer program they have to log into. Other schemes are much more open to taking a tour pack at any time, and some schemes have very specific call outs of when they take work. So doing your homework in that instance and making sure that you're applying in the right way at the right time is really important. And my other big piece of advice would be, while we all have different methods, we're all looking for the same thing. So it's the tour pack, having that all in one place, having really high quality marketing materials right from the minute that you're submitting to a programmer is really important. And I know that we as programmers know that sometimes those marketing materials are a total work of fiction because you haven't finished making the show yet. But it just needs to be something that we can see what you're going for so that we can then sell that on to promoters. So I guess that's, and then the other thing that I get asked a lot is, do schemes all program together? If I apply to one, do I get a whole tour across the whole country? Unfortunately not. That's just won't work with people's timelines, different budgets and all of that kind of thing. Schemes do work very closely together. We often share programming for special projects. We share ideas with one another if people are looking for something or they find something and they really think it should go further. And we take recommendations. So often if you've gone to one or two schemes in autumn, other schemes might come to you for spring. So you do get quite a long length of tour that you can make a show viable for. But generally you have to be in charge of that tour booking. And I think that's it. Thank you so much for bearing with me through my cough earlier. I can feel my voice going, so I'm going to be quiet. And I know Sophia's got some great insights to share with you as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I did promise everybody a 5-minute break, so let's do that. Let's be able to go and quickly stretch our legs. Please don't leave us because, like we say, Sophia absolutely has the gold from the artist's touring perspective and what it's like actually doing it. So we'll come back. It's now 53, so we will come back in 5 minutes' time, which gets us to 58, and I'm going to time you all and we'll start on time. Is that all right, everybody? I will see you shortly. Brilliant. We'll kick back off into the final section, which is over to Sophia. At the end of Sophia's bit, we will have time for Q&A. And again, remember, you can pop those questions in the chat or save them up for the end either way. And just to point out that Stephie's been putting some useful links and bits of information in the chat as well as we've gone along. But for now, I will spotlight you, Sophia, and hand over to you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. So I'm Sophia Hatfield. I am a freelance artist. So I'm a self-producing theatre maker, and I've worked a lot as a sort of jobbing performer on the rural touring circuit as well over the years. And I also run a theatre company called Stute Theatre, who have recently registered as a KIC, and we've done lots of rural touring. I've done lots of stuff on the rural touring circuit. So I've created and toured children's shows, family shows for rural touring, I've done a piece of outdoor work for a rural touring venue. I've done a show for sort of young adults, which had live looping and projection in it, again for rural touring, which was a rural touring commission. And I'm currently working on a three-handed show called I Am No Bird about the Bronte sisters, which is going to be touring very, very soon on some rural touring circuits. So I've done loads of it. And I just think it's an absolutely fantastic world to venture into as an artist. I have created some very simple slides, but what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit about each thing that I'm going to talk about, and then I'll summarise with a slide, because it's nice to be able to talk to everyone. So I wanted to talk a bit about why do rural touring as an artist and what makes it great from the artist's perspective. And the first reason I think it's wonderful, and we've touched on this already, both Stephie and Tasha have talked about it. You can take work to audiences all over the country who might never, ever otherwise get to see your work. So it is a wonderful way to reach people, to reach audiences, and to take work into the heart of a community. And in addition to that, your performer-audience relationship when you're working in a rural touring venue is so, so different. There is no fourth wall. You have a really direct relationship with the audience, and it's really, really difficult to create that in a more formalised arts venue. Another thing that's been a real benefit for me as an artist from working with rural touring is that work that's suitable for rural touring is also suitable for loads of other venues. So my reach just spiraled out of control when I started doing rural touring, because work that's suitable for rural touring venues, if it can go into a village hall, it can probably go into a library. If it can go into a library, it can probably go into a community-run library that's not owned by a council. It can go into a school, primary school, high school. It can go into a community centre. So from touring with rural touring organisations, I've got relationships with libraries all over the country. I've even started touring work with housing associations in my local area, who will now fund me as an artist to take a play into an inner city housing association and reach communities who do not go to the theatre. Most of my audiences on that tour had never seen a piece of theatre before. We asked them and they hadn't. So it's opened up a whole world for me. Another reason I absolutely love it is because as an artist, it gives me much more agency and choice about how I tour my work, where I tour my work, when I tour my work, because I can decide what dates I want to make available. So absolutely, once I've decided I'm going to tour this 2 weeks, I don't change that, because you don't want to mess communities around. But just having that choice of being able to go, do you know what, I'm going to block out these 2 weeks, I'm going to offer these dates, and having that agency and choice doesn't always come to you that often as a freelance artist, especially. And I've really found that that's made my work-life balance a lot better, and it's just been a really nice thing to be able to do as a freelancer, as a self-producing performer. Another thing that is absolutely amazing about the world of rural touring is the support network. There is a vast network of support for artists. So I think Stephie's already mentioned the regular artist meetups, the chats. During the pandemic, they became an absolute lifeline for me, because it was a place where I could come and find out what was going on, because the NRTA sort of had a direct line on, because they were going in the big meetings with central government and the Arts Council to find out, how long is this going to go on for? Are we going to get any funding? And that support network's been invaluable. There's lots of commissioning opportunities. So I've been able to R&D work that I would have never otherwise been able to make, because of a little pot of funding that was made available by a rural touring organisation. So for me, it was spot on, did a commission to create work for young adults in libraries. And that R&D commission turned into a really big show, which ended up winning an award. And I'd wanted to make that show for ages, but actually, getting hold of funding to R&D something properly as an artist is very challenging. And rural touring does try to offer those things to artists, and in a fair way as well. So usually it's a very easy application process for those kind of commissions. There's loads and loads of support in applying. You can ask questions, and it's always just very open, very friendly. So that's been fantastic. And the biggest plus for me, my sort of final point for rural touring, is the challenges of creating, for me, I'm a theatre artist. So the challenges of creating work in a non-theatre space that is a little bit small and doesn't have lighting and has technical limitations, that is a huge creative opportunity, and it's completely changed the way I think about my work, because those limitations, the way you find a way around them can open up amazing possibilities. And off the back of that, I've ended up doing, I ended up doing telephone theatre shows, and, and it was because my way of thinking changed when I had to overcome sort of, how are we going to do this without lights? So that's the sort of advantages. I'm going to try and share my screen, and I've summed up those little bullet points in a shorter way. Oh, Keynote, that's what I want to share. Share. Allows you, oh, hang on. So I'm trying to get Zoom to let me share my screen, and it's not letting me. So what I might have to do is share those slides another time. Yeah, it's not letting me do it. I do apologise. I've got a new MacBook and I don't think I've set it up properly. But I'll move on. I will share those slides after the session. So if anyone just wants to see a sum up of what I've gone through. I wanted to talk a bit about the early conversations I have when I'm making a piece of work, because I think one of the things that I think it's really helpful to think of as an artist when you're making work for rural touring, you have to sort of embed some principles quite early to allow you to not have problems to overcome much later. So I always like to talk to rural touring organisations quite early when I have an idea for a show. So I'll usually approach a few people who I've sort of worked with before and say, I've got this idea, what do you think? And that's usually a good starting point. But once I've formulated the idea and I know what show I want to make and how I want it to look and what subject matter we're going to explore, I try and sort of pin down a few things extremely early. And I think this does sort of loop back to what Tasha was saying earlier about the information, and what Steph was saying, the information you need to send to be included in those menus. Even if the show's not made yet, you need to know these things. So I create an information sheet about the project that just lays all of this out really, really clearly, with a couple of photos of the work if I've R&D'd it, or something similar that could be used if I haven't. So I put a brief synopsis of the show in, kind of like what I imagine the marketing copy is going to look like eventually. I work out a cost per show, and I work that out very early because it just helps everyone if they know how much it's going to cost. And it also helps me budget for the project as it emerges, to sort of say, well, look, we can't have a cast of 8 because we've said we're going to charge this much for it, so we can't afford to do that. I decide how many shows I can perform in a day. How many shows I'm willing to perform in a day as an artist on my own is not the same as how many shows I expect a cast that I've hired in to perform. So I sort of mark that out very early. I talk about the show requirements, how much floor space I need, how high it's going to be, how many plug sockets. And if I don't know that for sure yet, that then becomes part of the design brief. So if I've said that, I say it early, and then whoever else I'm working with, all the other creative team, get those limitations as well. So we know that it can't take up more than this much space. The set can't be taller than however many meters, and it all has to be doable on one plug socket or no plug sockets, depending on where we want to tour it. I decide the size of the cast, and I also decide the size of the touring and the production team. So whether I'm going to tour it on my own, whether we're going to need a stage manager, whether we need a production manager or some production support, because I think it's just good to know those things early, whether you're planning a tour of something that kind of you already have made, or whether you're planning to put an Arts Council application in. I just like to know that ASAP. And as I think people have already said, it just makes it much easier for the venues, and it makes it easier for you as well, because it means you don't have to backtrack and figure all that stuff out when you're halfway through a rehearsal process and really stressed. So I start these conversations early, and then that means that I've got my expected venues, my confirmed tour venues ready and on an Arts Council application, all ready to send sort of in good time. And what I also do as an artist, and I found this really helpful, is if I know if a rural touring scheme really likes the idea and wants to book it, I ask for a letter of support, and I attach that at the end of all of my funding applications, so that whoever I'm applying to, whether it's the Arts Council or someone else, they can see that, you know, it's been thought through, and that there is a potential audience for this work, and there is some support for this work from the communities that I want to reach, from the places that I want to tour to. So again, there's a whole slide just with a bullet point list of those things, which I will share. There are some practical things that I've learned. So everything I've learned about rural touring, I've either learned through mentoring through schemes, particularly through schemes like Spot on Lancashire, which is sort of my closest one probably, and Arts Out West up in Cumbria, and the Cheshire Rural Touring Arts as well. So I have been mentored a little bit in my early career and a lot by Spot On, actually. But I've also learned a lot on the job. So I just wanted to share some bullet points and pitfalls that I've learned on the job. So I've already talked about this, but height and staging is important. And I know it's already been said, but I do want to talk about ceiling height, because particularly when working with a creative team, if you're collaborating with a director and a designer, you need to really make sure that director and designer understand the needs of rural touring venues. Because a lot of people don't, a lot of really good people don't. So you just need to really be steadfast and clear in those things. And height limit is a big one for designers. But the height limit isn't just about the height limit in the space you're performing in. It also needs to be, well, is the thing going to get through the door? Is it going to be able to do a get-in through a windy corridor? Can you get it up some stairs? Because a lot of rural touring venues, the get-ins aren't that easy. So I always include in my design brief, it has to fit in this side venue. It has to be easy to carry. A lot of shows I've toured on my own, so it has to be easy for me to carry on my own. And again, I like to make sure that we can do as much of that without any help from the venue as possible, so that we know that even if everything goes wrong and something's happened and the promoters had to run off to an emergency, as long as the door to that venue's open, we can get the show in and get it on without any disruption. Again, with the height limit thing, it's not just about even the venue, it's also about the transport. So I also include the size of whatever I'm transporting the set in the design brief. So it has to fit in this size of van, or quite often it has to fit in my car, which is a Citroen C1. And the amount that you can fit into a Citroen C1 when you have a theatre designer's brain thinking about it is actually incredible. I've toured 3 full shows in my Citroen C1. I have some pictures of it. They're on my website. You'll be amazed at what you can fit into the tiniest of cars if you've thought it through. But the key is thinking about it at an early stage. So if we've got, 3 pieces of set, we know that they have to pack into each other so that it's just one thing in the car. Again, leading on from that, occasionally rural touring venues and especially library venues, you might find yourself performing at a space that doesn't have a lovely car park with a loading bay that opens directly into some double doors. So on numerous occasions, I've found myself lugging bags of musical equipment across a Tesco car park and along a busy road to get them into the front door of quite a big library. So it's usually fine, but it's just worth, again, thinking about making things as easy for yourself as possible. And also having that conversation with the venue and just being like, what's your parking like? What's your loading like? Because then if you know it's going to be a nightmare, you can ask someone to come and, I've sometimes will be like, can I just hire someone for a couple of hours to come in their car locally and just help with that get-in? And it just makes your life loads easier. So I've spoken about space as well. So I always do sort of state the minimum amount of space that a show needs to perform in. But I just wanted to add to all of that if you can be flexible, that's better. So obviously some shows, flexibility isn't an option, but I think particularly for touring to smaller community venues and libraries, particularly if it's a sort of children's show or something that, might need to go into a little corner of a library, if you can be flexible and go, do you know what, if we lose a metre either side, it's not the end of the world. Or if the backdrop can be sort of adjustable in height, so it can drop down by a couple of feet if it needs to, it's better, and it makes your life easier, and it makes venue volunteers and librarians and venue staff feel much better, much more confident, because sometimes venues can feel anxious when you turn up with 18 boxes of stuff and wires looping out everywhere. So the more flexible, the better. It's not always possible, but where it is possible, it's great. Other technical requirements that I've learned along the way, PAT testing has been mentioned sort of in passing in the session. Any electrical equipment you tour has to be PAT tested, budget for that. If you're budgeting for a tour, budget for pack testing, because it's not always possible to get someone to come and do it for free. It's not, if you're not supported by a big arts venue who has an electrician on site, and it can be quite expensive, and it's not always as simple as you think. So just budget for that, make time for it, kind of just before you go into rehearsals when you've got all your kit in one place. And similarly, thinking about pack testing and electrical safety, you can have everything pack tested, but you also then need to speak to that technician about the kinds of venues you're going into. I usually just work with sound equipment. I don't really tour lighting equipment. And one of the reasons for that is that there's a lot more thought that goes. Sound equipment is generally quite low voltage, so the chances of you overloading a venue's plug socket are quite low. So as long as you've double checked, you've got access to more than one plug socket. If you're using more than one items of kit, you're probably fine. I would still check, but you're probably fine. As soon as you get into the world of touring any kind of portable stage lighting, you need to know how much power those things use, and you need to make sure that they're not going to overload someone's plug sockets. It's not happened on one of my shows, but I have been in get-ins where, a fuse has blown, the whole place has been plunged into darkness. So it's just worth knowing. It's just, it's something that I wouldn't normally think about as an artist, but as a self-producing artist, it's been very helpful to know. And then if everything that I've just said feels like a huge amount to plan and an absolute nightmare, I would just say, consider hiring a production manager. A freelance production manager for 2 or 3 days could do all of that, and we'll just think of things that you haven't thought of. That's been a huge thing for me in the past couple of years, has been actually just bringing an extra freelancer on board for a couple of days on a project who has that training and that skill set and can support with that. And I'm a big fan of production managers for that reason. Similarly, doing your risk assessment, you usually have to provide a risk assessment to every venue, and it's not particularly complicated, but it's really reassuring to have a trained production manager with that experience writing that risk assessment for you, and then you know that everything's covered and everything's going to be all right, which is very nice. Similarly, as I've started to make more ambitious work, this has become more relevant, just bringing on project support. So hiring a freelance producer, even if it's just to do a day a week once you're on tour, to make sure that if you don't have time to have those conversations with venues, if something changes, there's someone who can respond to those emails and be really on it. It's not a huge budget line in your project, and there are people with those skills, and it just makes your life easier and it makes your project better. Producing support, admin support, stage management support, production management support. If you can bring those people on board, even just for a couple of days, it makes a huge, huge difference. I've talked about making sure the designer's aware of the limitations of venues. I would also say, and this is something that I've started to learn more and more, budget quite generously if you're applying for funding for travel, petrol and accommodation. I think particularly now COVID's hit, there's a wonderful tradition in rural touring of being able to stay in people's homes when you are visiting a village somewhere. But the reality of that under COVID is it's just not always practical. It doesn't always feel safe. And if you're touring 10 different venues in a couple of weeks, the last thing you want to do is just be spreading COVID from house to house in lots of village communities. So I'm finding, even on a current project, we're having to budget so generously for accommodation because we're putting our cast in hotels because it feels like the safest thing to do. And often, if you're touring, I've toured a lot of shows in my little Citroen C1, which is amazing because it doesn't use a huge amount of petrol and it's quite a green way of touring. But as my company's work has grown more ambitious, we are now touring in a van, and the cost of doing that is just much, much higher. And it's always worth, whatever you think you need to budget for petrol, I would just add a bit on, because it just catches up. It just catches up with the budget. So that's kind of my list of things that I've learned by visiting lots of rural touring venues on tour. The other things I want to talk about quickly, I just wanted to talk quickly about communicating with venues. Because lots of rural touring venues are run by volunteer promoters or a team of volunteers, I think communication is really important. So I always try and have a phone call with the promoter at each venue if I can, just to sort of say hello and make sure I've thought of everything and make sure there's not something that we didn't know about the venue, and double check that the ceiling is high enough, and how, what time are we going to let the audience in. And that makes a big difference then when you arrive, and those discussions have already been had, and it means that your performance day isn't stressful. You can just calmly set up and know what you're doing. But I also just try and give people really, really good information. So what I've started doing is putting together a Google Drive or a Dropbox Drive and just having in there like our sort of venue tour pack. And that's just something that you can add to throughout the tour. So I have all my marketing information in there. I usually have a list of pre-written tweets. All of the show photos go in there, and we can add show photos as, if we're touring and we get new photos and lovely things happen, a trailer for the show. And also all of the show's requirements, and it's just in one place, and you can just immediately share that with a promoter. It means if someone goes off sick and they have to hand it over to another promoter, that the information's just there in one place. And I found that quite an efficient way, because it can be quite time consuming sending everything to every single venue. So that's a nice little time saver way that I found of doing it, which probably seems really obvious. And on top of that, in terms of show promoting, I've found it really valuable. Again, it's just bringing in outside help where you can. I found it really valuable to work, just to hire a freelance social media person on projects who can do the bulk of that work when a project's on tour, so that those lovely photos that we're taking get shared properly, and the correct venues get tagged in it, and the correct people get tagged, and we use all the right hashtags, because that's really difficult to find time to do when you're on tour, and it's really valuable, and it's just a lovely thing to do. The last thing I wanted to go through really quickly, I'm so sorry, I've raced through loads. I just wanted to talk about some of the creative things that I found helpful, because my favourite thing about rural touring is how inventive you can be in finding ways around some of the technical limitations. So some of the things that I found really helpful are floor cloths, because you can make a huge impact with a floor cloth and it packs down really, really small, as long as it's safe for your actors to walk on. Versatile staging that allows you to find different heights. So if you don't have a stage, you're often performing on the flat. We found that if we take in like one set piece that you can climb on and get high on and low on, that doesn't take up much space and that can be used in 2 or 3 different ways, that can be really helpful. We've even used things like reinforced cardboard boxes, 3 different sizes, and arranged them in loads of different ways, and you can get quite high on them. Portable set pieces that can create height. We've also found using really, really simple technology in very creative ways has got big wins on the rural touring circuit. So some of the things that we've used a lot are loop pedals. So I often put music in shows, but if there's not a stage manager to cue it, you can do an awful lot with a loop pedal musically. Sort of you can pre-program things and just press one pedal and it's on, and you can live loop stuff. And in terms of lighting, because we don't tour lights, what we have done a lot, which has worked, is use either shadow puppetry, using very, very simple light boxes in children's shows. So we've had a show that had shadow puppetry under a table, just with really simple camping lights. It worked in full daylight, so we didn't need a blackout, and it just gave a little bit of an extra effect in a show where we couldn't have any lighting. And we've used a projector really creatively to back project different images. And if you use a projector to create colour, that actually gives you a bit of lighting without having to tour really heavy stage lights. But just to bring everything back to the final point that I wanted to make, is that the key is your audience relationship. So that's the thing that I've found the most helpful as an artist when creating work, is to think all the time about that audience relationship. So I've just seen your last minute direct message. I didn't see it while I was chatting. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Sophia. That was absolute gold insight. Really appreciate it from all the speakers. Thank you. We only have 6 minutes left, so we're going to have rapid Q&A. So handing over to our audience members who are here today, and just whether anyone has anything particularly they'd like to ask. Go ahead.
I have too many questions. So I think my question is going to be, would it be possible to ask more questions to someone? Where shall I aim my torrent?
My email is in the chat. So it's admin@nrtf.org. I'm sure it'll be sent around with any notes that are going out after this.
Can you send it?
Yeah. I work 2 days a week for the NRTF, and a lot of that time I spend working with artists like you guys, giving information, pointing you in the right place on our website and that kind of thing.
Okay, cool.
Go over people's tour packs and programming emails. 2 days does not go very far with the amount of work I have to do. So it often takes me a couple of weeks to get back to you, which sounds insane, but it's often only 5 working days if you think about how it works for me. But I am more than happy to answer questions. We are trying to fit into about an hour and a half, something that we took 2 weeks and ran an online course with to cover everything. There is a lot of information to get your head around in rural touring. There's an awful lot of moving parts. Sophia is now an absolute whiz at it, and everything she just said is amazing. But I'm also very aware that it might be very overwhelming. And like Sophia said, schemes want to work with artists and make them as passionate about rural touring as Sophia is. And so we do take time to work with artists, especially if we know that you've never done it before. If we know that we're your first rural tour, we do like to take that time and work with you and make sure that we've got things right, and that when you say this is rural touring friendly, it genuinely is. So yeah, I think that's just something to keep in mind, is that go and make friends with your local scheme. I can't champion this enough. Go and see a rural touring show in a rural venue. Absolutely the best way to see it in action, to get an atmosphere. And I think maybe one of the things that I'd quite like to end on is something that everybody quotes in one of these sessions when we do it. A colleague of ours called Rosie, who worked in rural touring for 25 years, she said that with most performing arts venues, you're inviting the audience into your space. You're inviting them to come see you. With rural touring, the audience is inviting you to go and see them. And it is a big difference, and it's a beautiful and wonderful thing. And it's something to be really aware of, and something to make sure everyone that you're touring with is also aware of it. Because some of you might be sat there thinking, that sounds horrific. And that's okay. It's okay. It's not always for everyone, but it's a really important thing to understand. And that dynamic, it's the magic of rural touring.
Yeah, thanks, Stephie. That's great. So, got lots of contacts and ways to ask more questions. Is there anything that anyone wants to ask now that kind of they need to leave with the answer to?
Could I? Hi, Lisa. Hi. Just can I ask one very quick question? The reason I say that, I don't know what happened, but my sort of thing with the Zoom completely crashed. So I missed a few minutes, and I was very interested in what Stephie was saying about if you're really interested in getting into rural touring, that there could be some help and support. And I think that's kind of where I am, and I missed what happened then. So where should I go to have a chat to someone and get some help and support to get me going down the right direction? Because I've got a lot of the ingredients I think you're looking for.
Fantastic. So what we've said is that we're going to share the email addresses for Stephie and Tasha, and Sophia has offered the same. So you can ask your questions directly to them and kind of get that input. But they've all said that they work part-time and it might take them a little while to get back to you, but they definitely want to help. So I'll make sure that gets to you, David.
I'll just ask a quick question. I just wondered, do the Arts Council have a view on rural? You know, is it in fashion? Is it out of fashion? Are they looking?
They love it. They absolutely love it.
Oh, great.
Obviously, it's still about the art and the show that you're touring. But yeah, rural touring it hits a lot of the Arts Council's main points at the moment. If you've read Let's Create, we do have a wonderful quote where Sir Nick Sirota, when talking to our director, said, well, you guys originally wrote Let's Create and have been doing it for 25 years. So yes, we are kind of in vogue at the moment.
Excellent.
That does mean competition is high. And it is about making sure that if you're putting in that funding application, you have had those conversations with schemes beforehand.
Yeah.
And you've also thought about timelines, because one of the things that happens is if we are taking a show that is waiting a funding deadline, we need to know that way in advance, because if we let down our promoters last minute because that funding didn't come through and now you can't tour next month, that's a relationship we spent a lot of time cultivating. And it's not easy for us to then find them another show. So just think about that in terms of your timeline of when we're thinking about programming and how you communicate that with us.
Fantastic. Jax, I've seen you've unmuted yourself. Go ahead.
Just quickly, you mentioned about membership on the website, and that's free today, did you say?
Well, I will turn it off tomorrow at 5 o'clock. It's free on RTF membership at the moment that gets you access to all of our resources. The stuff I've put in the chat is free anyway. But what's the main really useful thing, and it's not just because I spend half my week planning it, but it's the Friday bulletin where I round up every call out that every scheme has got at the moment, every piece of news. And also you can use the discussion boards. So if you're touring a show and you've put out lots of emails and you want to drip feed that information again, you can put it on our discussion boards. And everything that anyone's posted that week goes into our Friday bulletin, which goes out to all our members, which includes schemes, venues, arts organisations, festivals, artists.
Amazing. Thank you so much, everybody. We've gone a little bit over, but I think we've done very well to cram all of that in. Like you say, such a lot of information. And thank you so much for our very generous speakers for all of your information and offers to continue to support people. Obviously, Bradford Producing Hub is here to provide support. We want to help people make and tour their work. So equally, please feel able to get in touch with me and the team at BPH to get advice and support in making funding, getting those contacts and making it all happen. So thanks so much. Really appreciate everybody's time, and I will see you all again, no doubt.